Oh, that's alright. So I, am gonna, yeah, set up. I'm gonna talk for a little while, present my case, and then I want to see if you can take it apart, critique it, agree, disagree, add to it, see what you can do. Quite happy for you to take it apart if you need to. My case is that the 21st century is the post-future era. Um, that we are at the end of a short cycle and a long cycle. The short cycle is the biggest change that modern Western human culture has had in 250 years, and the longest cycle is pushing that out to sort of 500 years. And that the time we are in now is a liminal period between two epochs. Um, the one that ended with the 20th century and whatever freaky thing we're going into now. Cool. And I think this liminal period will last decades at least. Yeah. Cool. So what am I talking about? So post future. So basically we've it's the end the Enlightenment has ended. The futurist era, the idea that the future will lead us to a grand and wonderful life on Earth with technology doing all the work for us, and that the technology will save us from problems with the environment and this sort of thing. That's ended. Modernism in the sense of new for the sake of new, and that the idea of our culture being pointed towards the future. This is all ending. Cool. So let me set it up how we got here in the first place. So there's 2 starting dates. The first one would be, the beginning of the expansion of naval empires, starting, of course, with the Spanish and Portuguese, with the big historical act being, Cristoforo Colombo, better known as Columbus, landing, in 1492 in El Salvador, Cuba, and then later in South America. So this started an expansion. Before this, there had been empires. There'd been the Persian Empire, enormous empire, the Roman Empire, which wasn't as big as the Persian Empire, this sort of thing. There'd been the Holy Roman Empire, all of all of this, but this naval expansion broke the human imagination into these new frontiers, and you see this echoed in TV shows later, like Star Trek, which is the perfect epitome of the age that has ended that I'm talking about. With that became there's always more in the world to understand, and there's always more or more to go at, and then science will eventually give us all the answers, all of this. Okay, that's the long cycle, is this 500-year thing that starts with expansion that is both ideological, the search for ideas, as well as the search for land and resources. The shorter cycle, the 250, almost 250-year one, starts with the French Revolution, which really gives us the secular rationalist scientism sort of age that we had that created, um, America as a state. Cool. Any questions so far? Cool. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so firstly, a lot of people may be going, well, it's a given. We always point ourselves towards the future. And this is not true. For most of human history, cultures have walked backwards, pointing backwards in time. So you look at your line of descendants. You are who you are because you're a line of people from your clan or your whakapapa if you're Maori, which is the concept of both of descendant line, family line, your genetics and that sort of thing, but also your spiritual line, and where you belong. For most of human history, humankind's have walked facing backwards, looking at the footsteps they're leaving behind. This keeps going for for a very long time. So, the ancient Greeks, for instance, venerated the Egyptians and the Persians. They were trying to get they were trying to become as wise as the Egyptians and the Persians were. In the Middle Ages, they venerated the biblical times, um, the lost knowledge of the past, the back when people walked in the Garden of Eden and talked to God directly, supposedly, and, they cities and things were built on the model of could we only just return to the Egyptian architecture when people were so great at building stuff. Orthodox Judaism still believes in many cases that Adam and Eve were the most perfect human beings and we're all become degraded lesser forms. And the further we move away from the Garden of Eden, the less perfect we've become. So it's exactly opposite. It's not this point towards becoming more perfect. It's it, it's a looking towards the time when things were better than they were, or and a great person can be an iota of that Adamic ideal. Um, so and you've got ancestor worship going as back as far as we can remember. Cool. So the big act which changes this, firstly, you got these expansions, naval expansions creating empires, and that you go out in the world, new stuff, new things, and this search for novelty. And then you get, yeah, strange people turning up in courts, speaking, wearing strange clothes and speaking strange languages, and being presented as indigenous people to royals. So this idea of frontier is a searching for new things. So that's the long cycle that created our lust for novelty rather than a lust to return to the wisdom of the past. Then that comes to an absolute focused head with the French Revolution. Where's that? Which is what, 1789, I believe. So the French Revolution was a deliberate, forceful, brutal, and violent break from tradition. It was, let's smash the traditions. The reasons why were understandable. You had a bloated aristocracy and who weren't paying taxes and were self-serving. You had a a Catholic institution that was also becoming corrupt, and you had a mass of, I don't know, do you want the proletariat or whatever you want to call them, the workers who were outright starving, bread shortages, this sort of thing. Cool. And so you had this bizarre shift. I can't think of another time in history it ever happened. Certainly very unique in the way it happened. Sudden distrust of religion in the most brutal way, in the execution of tens of thousands of people. On and it was not the way it's presented a lot of times to people in high school. It was a brutal, ideologically possessed time. So, people go, "Oh, what we got the metric system from that," and things like this that are so rational and helped us expand and but, that's not what they were really trying to do with the metric system exactly. Um, it was really new for the sake of new. For instance, here's an example. They were also trying to create decimal time. They stated they wanted a 10-day week, and in the 10-day week, you had days made up of, well, you had anyway, you had decimal hours with 100 minutes, and you had decimal minutes with 100 seconds. And, like, screw nature, like, no longer are our weeks, descended from moon cycles where you have, 4 week cycles in a 28-year moon turnover. It was like there was this, idea that man should overcome nature and we should have a purely mathematical reality. This was the reason the decimal week uh didn't happen is because people didn't want 1 day off out of every 10 days. Yeah, exactly. So an absolute, ideology, that presents itself as rational, but has many unrational things. So here's an example that always bugs me, and I might be totally alone on this, but why the hell decimal? Why the hell is the number system based on 10? Okay, and people go, 10 fingers? Okay. 10's kind of a brutal number. How often do you need a fifth of something? You could have had 12. Yeah, yeah, well, if you're in the States. But, like, we could have had 12. Twelve's a much more, pragmatic number. It gives you access to halves, thirds, quarters. Our time cycle is built on 12s because 12 fits into 60, and you got 2 lots of 12 hours making your day and your night. 12 is how many notes we have in our musical system, which is Pythagorean. Pythagoras came up with the 12-note system, as far as we can tell, which is 2,500 years old. We could have put our counting system and our currency and had it fit with our time system and fit with our musical system. Now people go, "Oh, but we don't have 12 fingers, so that's bollocks." But on your hand, you have 12 knuckles. So, you can count all the counting you need to do. Yes, and you can do it on one hand. So, I argue that that is just as rational as the 10 fingers. Um, as far as I can tell, purely ideological reasons. Too, it was new for the sake of let's break tradition. It was quite a cruel maneuver. People I talk to who are, in their 80s and 90s, um, talk about how it was way easier to calculate if you worked in a shop or something. It was way easier to calculate imperial 12-based systems in your head, and then when they changed to decimal, everyone had to start using calculators, and it was quite a brutal shock, and I think the idea was, look, once you get used to it, you'll be able to do, um, the 10 mathematics in your head, but in the most cases, people just continue to use calculators, and the things that we used to be able to do in our mind became machines. Cool, so I don't know how the audience feels about that, but it's to me, it's one of the examples. I'll give one other example. Sorry, you wanted to say something. So the last example of, the brutality of the French Revolution is they hated religion. They were, trying to destroy traditional Christianity. And the very first thing they do, and this is the problem of all satanic acts, is they started 2 churches. One of them was a church of atheism, the other was a church of deism, um, and they only lasted a couple of years. The first thing they started doing was arguing with each other about who had the most true church. Yeah, and I'll put that as a side, just a piece of advice: if you don't like the system you grew up with, don't just invert all the values. Don't just make everything that was good bad and everything that was bad good. Or you're still playing the same game. You're on the other team. It's like you grew up in a soccer family and you hate soccer and you resent all the times that your dad made you practice soccer. And so you grow up and instead of like being free, you join the team that your family hates and dedicate your life to that. Our friend Aurora made the perfect slogan for this: inversion without liberation. And there were aspects of the French Revolution that were inversion without liberation. Cool, okay. So that leads us to the age of rationalism. I'd say the next huge paradigm shifting act was the train. Cool. So what the train is a, transport system that's speedy, and can move a mass number of people. But most importantly for me, my point of view is that it was the first, um, huge machine like the first huge mass transport system that was available to people regardless of class. Train tickets were cheap enough that poor people could get on them and go somewhere else to work somewhere else. The train created the modern nation. Um, so this is true everywhere. It's true in Britain. It's true in India, which is an interesting case we might want to talk about in a second because you might know more about that than I do. But America is a good example. Before the train, America was United States, as in united separate little things that mostly do their own thing but have come to an agreement. It wasn't long before that America was three different nations. It was an English British Empire. It was parts of it were French Empire, and parts of it were the Empire of Mexico, which was short lived, but almost reached the entire western seaboard, almost up to Canada. Almost made it. Went up. No, they became their own thing briefly. Yeah. Okay, so all these different places. Different states, different cities, different communities in the states spoke different languages. English was not the only language in the states. The idea that America is an English-speaking place, I think, became about partly due to trains. So what do I mean? In Texas, there are still a handful of people who grow up speaking German. Then you got the Pennsylvania Dutch who speak Plattdeutsch, which is a type of German from a few hundred years ago. They're the Mennonites and the Amish. You've got still speaking people in Louisiana, but there were more of them. There were Spanish speaking people there. There were huge Celtic communities everyone's forgotten about, speaking Scottish, Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and possibly others. There were Norwegian places like Minnesota, is largely Norwegian, I think. Maybe Swedish, but I think Norwegian. So there were huge pockets of and Chinese and a few others. So there were huge pockets of people speaking all different languages. Okay, so the train also creates the nuclear family. The nuclear family, in a sense, is a unit where you put a legal unit where you say the family is a father, a mother, and some children. And I argue it was created in order that you could more easily shift people around to do work. This is also a great perversion of the human norm in which extended families, where children are raised by father, mother, grandparents, sometimes grandparents, because people had children young, and aunties and uncles, always aunties and uncles around. This is still the case for all indigenous cultures, and I have Maori, nieces and nephews, and yeah, our families, even though that, me and my parents are white, Pākehā, as we call it in New Zealand, uh it just the whakapapa idea, the idea of extended family just makes so much more sense at every practical level. It's what he was this idea of making a family as a legal unit, only a mother and father and some children is kinda cruel, and, it was because they shift the working class around, to get jobs, and they started industrial farming also with a steam engine. This was huge. All the music at the time changes from flowing rhythms like you get in classical music to mechanical drum beats. There's all these train songs we now think are quaint and as old-fashioned and quaint were actually about the hyper new technology at the time. All this blues music about your baby done dumped you, so you're gonna leave town on the lonesome train. Um, and the rhythms, every Johnny Cash song, because that was they grew up with the train rhythm. I argue that the rock and roll drum beat is, a adapted steam engine. Cool. And for those who know me well, I'm a musician. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. 'Cause, and absolutely, it was all about modernism. So, it was about the blues songs tend to be about, a handful of subjects to do with the condition of Black people at the time and the adjacent poorer white people who are living around them. Uh, you've got songs that are there because, blues is adapted from European folk song on one hand, and then, um, yeah, equatorial African, some rhythmical aspects from Africa and the use of the minor pentatonic scale and, microtonalism in the way you sing, which, is a little more of the African tradition. So you can still go to Africa and hear traditional music that sounds like blues where they're singing the same scales. Um, and there's been lots of crossover. So the themes in blues are, typical human things, love, but also being poor, but also racism, but trains, then cars in the 50s. It was all about the trains and the cars. So it was all about how their lives were being there's a big part about how their lives were being affected by technology and status and pulling yourself out of poverty, and so if they weren't singing about being down and out, they were singing about how awesome their Rocket 88, Oldsmobile new car V8 was, like, which was, some people say was the first rock and roll song, Rocket 88. Yeah, 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 that's right. And this is, like, still going in gangster rap, right? This is well, yeah, it's just blues redone. Um, cool, so the train creates the modern nation, the idea that you can travel around in it. Compare this to feudalistic medieval times where, you weren't even free to leave the county if you were a poor person. My name's Ari Freeman, that means I'm probably descended from the Freemen, and the Freemen were farmers who owned their own land. Uh, in comparison to peasants who worked the land of the Lord, and they were not permitted to leave the county, whereas the Freemen were. Does that make sense? And the peasants would pay, they'd give maybe they'd give a large part of their crop to in tax. Does that sort of make sense? Sweet. So I've kind of set the stage for the cycle that ended with the end of the 20th century. So this leads us to this trust in technology, well, and also this great upheaval from technology. The modernist age, which takes us into industrial farming, which allows us to have huge numbers of children. This idea that eventually that technology will bring about utopia, but also, a brutality by the time you get to the First and Second World Wars of how brutal technology can be, which was one of the early bad omens. And you end up with this thing borrowed from Christianity, which is borrowed from the idea of God's kingdom on earth. And there's a super long cycle thing with Christianity as moving away from circular and spiral time cycles to linear time with an end goal, which is God's kingdom on earth.
Mhm.
But that became technology became superimposed with that. And the perfect symbol for this to me is Star Trek, you know.
Was that an American religious innovation, the projection of the kingdom of God on earth actually being on earth, or do you see that deriving more from
No, I
French
think it's the whole
Catholicism?
I think it's the whole West.
Okay.
Yeah. And also like India and also and a little bit later on China and places like that too. So yeah, think about Star Trek. It's a post-scarcity plot. They're exploring space as a final frontier as a metaphorical extension of the expansion of empires, of expansion of the American frontier into the Wild West and that sort of thing, but also the naval empires.
Mhm.
Um, and and the racism and everything's ended and everyone's getting along, and now their only conflicts are with the new aliens they meet, like human beings have sorted themselves out.
Mhm.
Okay, so they set. I'm not sure exactly when this happens. I think this happens in the late 19th century. 2000 AD is set as the date of the future.
Mhm.
Cool. And it's this line in the sand, and our culture's walking towards 2000 AD. So I was born in 1981. I'm 40 years old. Um, but I think the 2000 thing goes back to my grandparents or great grandparents or great great grandparents. So, like in 1981, it's like, yeah, we go through decades. Each decade is new, all the new things, new fashion, new music, like rebelling from your parents, especially starting from especially the counterculture movement of the 60s was like the first big generational break, a huge generational break, but I argue not as big as the one that is happening now, that's about to happen. Yeah, so it's all about young people are trying to find the new thing, the thing that establishes them as their own group separate from their parents.
Mhm.
So each decade has a one or two revivals of something they're rehashing from the past, but otherwise newness, new technology in music, new technology in film, um, and new media technologies some of the time.
Mhm.
So in the 80s, there was a 1950s revival, 70s and 80s, which is you get this show Happy Days, which was still rerunning on TV when I was a kid. And that's Arthur Fonzarelli and everything. And it created this 1950s that isn't quite what actually happened in the 1950s, where people wear leather jackets. Grease is another
Mhm.
one in pop
Sure.
culture, right?
Sure.
And yeah, and in the 80s there was a little bit of yeah, what's still happening. You got Marilyn Monroe, you got like Madonna dressing up as Marilyn Monroe and things.
Mhm.
In the 90s, you got a 60s revival for the first half. Jimi Hendrix became super popular again, probably way more popular than he ever was previously. Jimi Hendrix never had a number one hit ever in his life, so he's more important in retrospect.
Mhm.
You got the grunge movement. Um, in the second half of the yeah, yeah, in the second half of the 90s, you got an 80s, first and 70s rock revival. I'm saying I'm a musician, in case you haven't. So a lot of it's going to come from music for me. And then in 1998, you got an 80s revival. So I'm going through my life and thinking, oh, there's a pattern here. So the next thing will be a 90s revival, right? So in the year 2002, I had this idea with my brother who was living with, we're flatting together at the time. And I said, we'll have the world's first 90s revival party. So we had a 90s revival party. People came dressed up in the clothes they wore in the first half of the 1990s, and a lot of people dressed up as grunge bands or, Antis the Hair or whatever. I've never been to another 90s revival party ever again in my entire life. There's arguably a little bit of a 90s revival going on now, but it's it's 20 years later. It's more than 20 years later. So the Date of the Future in 2000, I I went to the Gathering, a huge dance hippie festival, well, a rave festival and everything. And we celebrate and we're like, we got it, with the Date of the Future's here. And I'm like, cool, okay. When's the next Date of the Future? Let's set a new date and we'll have a new revival and we'll have a new decade and people will break out to new thing. And stone silence. No new date of the future has been set. Nobody born after 2000 thinks technology will save us and lead us to a utopia. Technology alone. That we can keep burning oil forever. I just keep burning oil because there'll be cold fusion or some energy replacement for it. The only person I can see in pop culture and wider sort of American Western, and globalist culture is Elon Musk, who looks like a futurist at first. He's like, yeah, technology will save us. So he does, but when you actually look at him, he has none of the optimism. He's trying to get to Mars because he thinks we're going to fuck Earth. Like he thinks Earth will be a wasteland. He built that Cybertruck thing, the one that he accidentally smashed the window of on stage. And they asked him, why did you make it bulletproof and bomb-proof? He said, because when you're a rich person driving through the Mad Max apocalyptic wasteland, you gotta have bulletproof glass and stuff to protect you from the barbarians who want to steal your oil.
Yeah.
Or like, no, not oil, steal your tech or
Batteries or
whatever.
whatever.
Yeah, sorry. So what's happening now? An endless cycling ad nauseum rehash love letter to the 20th century. Of the almost all the films are about stuff that people grew up with or set in the 20th century. If they are about the future, they're all dystopian. Like there's no utopian Star Trek being made in the last 20 years. It's dark stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, so the last part of this futurism thing was globalism. Now, I might mean something different than that, but some people do. I mean the idea of this idea that we had that we would end up eventually with borderless countries with free movement everywhere as global citizens. So again, a kind of utopian idea. Now, when I was a kid, I was being raised as a Baha'i, and they have this vision for, and they think it's a good thing, and one world government and a global language, and a sort of a greater peace where there's no more war and this sort of thing. Okay, so people are like, there's 20 years of people kind of giving up on this sort of thing. In 2008, there's an economic crash, the dot-com crash, and the which shows that our economic system is not serving us. You have all the environmental issues. All of these things build up in tension and make people give up on the idea that technology will save us. You had Y2K, a computer glitch that some people even thought was going to end the world, but basically showed that just a screw up in universal computer code could totally mess up the economic system. Right, and then the last, I would have said the last nail in the head, a recent one, but now we have the one Russia. But firstly, COVID 2020, COVID. The same people who were saying, let's get rid of borders and have no passports and everyone can go everywhere they want. I heard a lot of people saying that, borderless countries, or let's maybe even get rid of the concept of a country in general. Within a week, they're saying, close the borders, shut it all down, hold the disease. To me, that was the death of globalism, in the sense of that borderlessness.
Would you please say a little more about what globalism is to you? Just because that term has been
Yeah, I know. I
used to
think
mean
you're
so
trying
many different
to.
things by so many different people, a little precision, I think, would
Yeah.
help us
Yeah, sorry about
understand.
that.
No, it's
Yes,
fine.
I'm not necessarily meaning in the capitalist sense, because obviously that's going to keep on going for a little longer. I mean it in this idea of a global culture and the extensions of nations into a kind of world nation. So, like the European Union was an attempt at this. Um, does that kind of clear it up? And I guess I'm largely informed by the fact that I was raised in a religion until about the age of 12, where that was thought to be an extremely good thing. So like everyone, conspiracy theorists go on about one new world order as a really pejorative term, but the Baha'is were saying no, that's a good thing.
Yeah, so this is basically the utopian attempt to bring the whole world into a single system,
Yeah,
or at least everywhere in the world is in relation to the whole world, as opposed to there just being other places that are cut off and not
yeah,
really interacting with
yeah.
anyone else, doing their own thing somewhere else, out of sight, out of mind, in their
That's right.
own cultural world.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
okay.
there's a brutality in this that people who were divorced from their past by the Enlightenment do not understand, but indigenous cultures understand intently, which is that if you just open up the whole world, y- how do you protect the stuff that's important to you? Yeah, and we now know this. This is like COVID taught everyone this instantly. But yeah, if you just open up the whole world and you're indigenous people trying to make land claims, like happens here in New Zealand and everywhere else, um, and a large Chinese firm comes in and buys all the farmland that is being disputed over by indigenous people, like where are how do they inform their rights? Their rights in New Zealand, they're all written against the crown as a concept, against this extension of monarchy as an ideology. I don't want to go into that too much, but there was a short-sightedness to the globalist utopian dream. Okay, so the next thing that happens, and this is where you come in, because Victor and I have been having a lot of conversations about the Russian-Ukraine war, and because Victor is an expert in geopolitics, especially compared with me, and I'm just starting to learn about it. He's been teaching me a lot in this regard. So this is where I'm going to hand it over to him. But first, the Russia invades the Ukraine, and there's a geopolitical reason with NATO, which I'll let Victor explain. But behind us is the philosopher Dugin, and this idea of a rebellious act against the globalist Western hegemony, the idea that there should be one world culture and it is Western. And they're like, screw this. The Russia is its own separate thing. And he's arguing it from a point of, oh no, I'm being much fairer. I want a world of pluralism where a bunch of different people can do their own thing, and ignoring the brutality of the fact that Ukrainians are an ethnic group as well. But cool. So I'll pass it over to Victor. What do you think of my thesis? Are there things that are right or wrong about it? And is the Russia-Ukrainian war a new step, proving my point?
Okay, so first things first, let me try to restate your thesis as
Cool.
succinctly as possible, so
Yeah,
you
let's
can
do that.
correct me if I've got it wrong, and then we can move on.
Yeah.
Over time, the growth of empires and nation states has led them to come into conflict with each other. Those conflicts has caused people to react against them and to try and invent a way that those conflicts can be superseded. The way that can be superseded is a form of globalism where the world is integrated into a new whole.
Mm.
Because those utopians were in the West, the variety of globalism is Western. It is Western
Mm.
globalism, and that due to recent crises, that approach has been proven to have failed. And whatever is going to happen next is going to happen next from there. Is that a fair
Yes.
summation?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. That's the thing that's caused Russia to move. There's two other points that are really important, really, really important to my thesis. Because I'm sort of, as you can see, I'm taking a different line, but I think what you just stated is contained within what I'm trying to explain.
Okay.
There's two issues that are going to inform the next, whatever's happening next. And I don't have a clear idea of what that is, and I don't think anyone does. One is modern medicine and modern ideology, and we're talking about the Western capitalist industrialized one, means that up to half of all people can stop having children. This has never happened in all of human history, and this is going to be one of the big stories behind the new epoch. Let's put this just quickly in perspective. Through most of human history, especially in tribal cultures, women had to have 7 to 9 births in their lifetime just to keep their population stable. This is why the Old Testament of the Bible is all about go forth and multiply for the good of your tribe, for the Israelites or the Judeans. So I think this is a problem. Humans have never seen this on this scale ever before, and it's enormous, and I can't figure out why nobody's talking about it. It's also, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, it's one of the reasons why feminism's really important to people now, but was less important in the past, and why people can now discuss gender issues and things like this now in a way they couldn't in the past. And it's that if you have a uterus and society says that you should use it and you're raised in that perspective and you have 7 to 9 births in order to produce 3 living children and you're breastfeeding for all that time and everything, your body's being used in a way that means you're going to have a gender role, and then men have to do all the other stuff. Do you know what I mean? Basically, what I'm saying, I'm not saying this is fair. I'm saying our ancestors didn't have much choice. Also, with a lot of people a lot of people out there are at least a little bit upset with their gender or what society thinks their gender is. It's like now they can the freeing up from having children means boys can become girls and girls can become boys and they can be fluid and all sorts of things like that. And I don't want to get into too much of that, but that is one of the things that is the beginning of this new age. I'm not anti-feminist or anti gender politics, and I think I'm just finding it interesting that it's happening
Yeah.
Some philosophers like Camille Paglia say that that's indicative of a turnover of an age, and you saw it at the end of the Roman Empire and things like this. Maybe. And the last thing is the children born after 2000 didn't grow up with the date of the future, didn't grow up with the Star Trek future. I argue they are more different than any generation we have seen for maybe 250 years. It's going to be I predict it's going to be a way bigger cultural shift than the counterculture movement was in the 60s against the war generation, which was what the late 20th century was all about, that rebellion. The whole music industry and everything was built on that rebellion from the 60s onwards. So the second half of the 20th century, those 50 years. Yeah, does that kind of make sense? So
Yeah.
whatever's coming next, one of the central issues is going to be children, people not having children, and that there is a generation who has not had their day talking. The only person from this generation who's made a global impact, and she's a bit young to say anything particularly deep, is Greta Thunberg. And that we saw a premonition of the emotional power of that generation with the school protests that came out of Greta Thunberg. But because, how old was she, like 15 or something?
Yeah.
She wasn't yet sophisticated enough. When they get their spokespeople, watch out.
I, I
They're
let
20
me.
years old now, some of them. Like, it's going to happen pretty soon.
You may very well be right, but I'm
Mm.
definitely going to dispute that example
Cool.
because
Okay.
I don't think Greta Thunberg has said anything that she's thought. I think she acts purely as a microphone for her parents' fears.
Yeah, but I'm not arguing from the point of view that she has an ideology yet. I'm arguing that the emotional energy is there, waiting for an ideology. That young
Okay,
people have this angst.
yeah. Let's put a pin in this for the moment because
Yeah,
there's something really interesting that we
yeah.
can say about this, but we're going to have to come back to it because there's a bunch of stuff we need to do
That's
first
finished
in
up
order
all
to
the things
discuss that.
I wanted to say as an introduction anyway.
Okay, great. So one of the things that will reveal to us what stage we are in now is what happens next. If what happens next is that there's a radical shift away from globalization, then it will be revealed that the stage that we were in was the end of the globalization movement.
Yeah,
If what happens next is that the crises that we're experiencing that are indicators of the destruction of globalization are overcome through technological or managerial means, it will reveal that the situation that we're in is actually the continuation of globalization.
yeah.
Do you think that we have the evidence now to determine which of those two outcomes is actually the one that's going to occur?
No, I don't think we do. I think we are in a several decades long liminal period. I think those who are watching I'm Trying to Be One are seeing the tensions that are taking us out of the age of the late 20th century. But there is not a new ideology yet. You can see this with the types of protests that have been happening around the world. In New Zealand, we also had a protest on our parliament, an anti vaccine mandate protest that went on for a month. Yeah. Um, and this is an extension. This was motivated by the trucker protests in Canada. Um, and I found this very interesting. Um, what I'm seeing is a new political class that isn't moving along political standard political lines. Like, it's not like Labour voters, National voters, or Americans like Democrats, Republicans. It's actually a mixture of people getting together. The thing they have in common is they're really there's this huge build up emotional energy. Uh, it's the thing that got Donald Trump voted in the States. It was a fuck you vote. But they don't have a clear ideology yet. They're a new political class, I predict. But they haven't had their spokesperson. They haven't had someone come across, reconcile their fears and concerns, and say this is what we should do about it. So what they're doing at the moment, and I think this is what might be a few decades of this, people jumping from issue to issue, scrabbling to find meaning, scrabbling to find. They know what they're upset about. They don't know what to do about it. We know the age we are leaving. We're not quite clear what the next one is. There's all these young people who didn't grow up the way we grew up, but they don't have their spokesperson or they have to do something much harder than we did when the kids. We're not just rebelling against the previous decade. They're rebelling against the last 250 years, maybe even 500 years.
Okay, one of the major concerns of the 20th century was ideology. To make a Zizekian point,
Yeah.
this constant concern with the fact that ideology is already the default mode that we operate within, and that it is only with effort and analysis that we're actually capable of getting outside of ideology in the first place.
Do you agree with him on that?
So I don't know. This is the setup to a question I'm going to ask, which is going to entail that to you. So I asked you first. If that's the case, then in the 20th century, presumably the subjects that you're talking about, people born after 2000, will be an ideology, but will they know that they are? Okay.
I think definitely, yeah.
Okay, second point. Some people argue that in the 21st century, the capacity for ideologies to exist has been destroyed through technology, because in order for an ideology to exist, it has to be shared, and because the internet necessarily disintegrates everything, there's no capacity for a group ideology to arise from the internet. And that's why we see people moving from issue to issue to issue, because they always exist in a persistent present. So
I don't agree with that at all. In fact, I argue that the internet is an ideology. And this is where I would draw from Marshall McLuhan, who says the medium is the message. It's like, what? Why do we even have an internet? Because people thought people wanted to try out this idea of rhizomic type networks in the Deleuzian sense, the decentralized sending out of knowledge. And like part of the upset is that the internet dream of unbridled sharing of knowledge, and therefore like democratization of opinions. I don't really like, there's another way to put it, but whatever.
But that was the techno-utopian promise of the
What's the
internet
techno-utopian
90s,
promise?
was world peace and complete understanding of all of humanity, of all of the rest of humanity, because of constant contact and sharing.
It's highly ideological. And it still is. Like, we've had monopoly, we've got Facebook and internet monopolies, but look how pissed off, look how much angst that's causing in people.
Yeah, I agree. There is a lot of angst being caused, and I agree that it feels like there's a lot of ideology in the sense that there are many ideologies, but that could merely be a symptom of the effect of the degradation of humanity's capacity to exist in a shared space. And let me provide you a counterexample that we can compare it to. In the 20th century, the standard example of ideology is 20th century communism as determined by the United Soviet Socialists as the sort of Marxists, ideologues of the Central Russian school of communism put it forward. The Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist kind of current was something that actually captured, at least at the very least at the beginning, maybe a quarter of the world or half of the world as people who really believed in it, and it was centralized in the sense that the academic operations of the Soviet Union caused the downflow of the discussion throughout the hierarchy of ideological distribution. I don't think that's possible anymore in the age of the internet. So,
because of the internet? Because there's two, and you know more about this than I do, but there's two communisms, right? There's the setting up, and we've never seen the final one. The final one is everyone moves into communes that all have their own autonomy and equality within them, rather than the setup of a dictator type state and everyone has equal status under them.
In my analysis, communism is like Jesus in the sense that you can have any kind you like. There's an infinite array on the smorgasbord.
Because the later thing of a series of communes that all have equal status, that is kind of the internet dream.
Okay, let me be an orthodox Marxist and say that in orthodox Marxism, the original state of humanity is one of a natural form of communism, and that through the process of the political and economic derivations, each one elements of that natural communism have been cut away until now the only natural communism that exists in the present world is the innate natural relationship of the human being to their family, their parents and siblings and children, and that in the operation of the development of capitalism according to orthodox Marxism, this also will eventually be cut away until we're completely atomized subjects, and then from that moment on there's nowhere for humanity to go to except for the entire process to be destroyed, whether through the dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever other variety of wooden-tongued, ancient, and no longer applicable Marxist kind of terminology applies here. Eventually, somehow, we return, with a V, back to the original variety of natural communism, except it's one that reintegrates all of the technological and economic learning that we have done. So, and that's how you end up with the gay luxury space utopia communism of in the imagination of the Zoomers. Now, I obviously think that that's all a load of complete rot, but that is the analysis that they provide.
Yeah. And it's not the original internet dream that in digital form?
Well, the problem is that because utopias are always necessarily somewhat undefined, they always look kind of similar to each other.
Yeah.
So yes, and agree.
They're always religious.
But it's really difficult for me to draw a conclusion off the fact that one mushy thing is a bit like another mushy thing.
Okay, let's get back to, if it's okay, the Russia thing, unless you had more comments.
No. I love the flow of conversation. Let's follow it.
Okay, so it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine under Dugin's ideology that there is a monopolistic Western hegemony that expects the entire world that expects to be the new world order and expects everyone to become like it, and that this is an act. No, we want pluralisms. Is that do you agree with him? Do you agree that's the ideology they're moving? Is this militaristic movement, this act, indicative of that? And is that the end of that 20th century dream?
Okay. I will approach this in the safest way possible.
Yeah.
Which is from a strictly Western academic theoretical analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of Western academic theory and international relations, I'm a realist. I've been educated in the academy. The academy has presented the array of theoretical disciplines available within international relations and its whole family tree. I've assessed them all. I think realism is the one that is correct, specifically a form of
Can you just
offensive
explain what
realism.
realism is, what you mean by realism? Because I hear different things.
Yes. So offensive realism is a very simple theory. It says all states have some power. Intent is unverifiable. The international system is anarchic, meaning that it has no head in it.
Yeah.
So if you get into trouble as a state, no one's coming to save you. You're going to get stepped on, right? So this is the systems theory instantiation of the idea that the strong will do what they will, and the weak just have to suffer what they must.
Yeah.
Okay. The tragedy of great power relations is the fact that those three things exist means that all states are incentivized to arm. All states necessarily regard the arming of other states as a threat. Therefore, arms races occur. Therefore, all states compete against each other militarily all of the time, always looking to maximize their own power. And so far, no one has discovered a way out of it. That's my interpretation of the offensive realism. Okay. So the reason why I'm kind of giving that background of what it is because I want you and the audience to understand where I'm coming from, what my bias is. The reason why I declare it is because I know that I'm indoctrinated in a very specific academic approach, and it's really important that my approach is challenged by people who have perspectives outside of that in order to maximize my flexibility, because I want to be available to new ideas all of the time because I'm a good student of Western pluralist Enlightenment
we're both after
values.
the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. What the fuck was I talking about?
Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What does that mean to globalism in the sense I portrayed earlier?
Okay.
And is it the start of a new epoch?
How deep in this question should I start, and how long an answer do you want?
Oh no, it's open to you.
Okay, well in that case I'll go really deep and we'll do a long version.
Let's try it. Let's do it.
Okay. The North American continent is, geographically speaking, the most blessed continent for the production of geopolitical power.
Absolutely.
It has two massive moats. It has a mountain range on either side, which is an excellent defensive feature.
Yeah.
The inside is a beautiful, soft region of massive production of food.
Yes.
And it's overlaid with a river system, which means it's really cheap to move things around. This is Peter Zion's point. Okay. Therefore, the North American continent will always produce an excess of political power, in the sense that once the North American continent is unified under a single political system, it will have more political power that it knows what to do with. The primary North American question is, what do you do with that excess political power?
Yeah.
If you're an isolationist, you say, we do not go abroad in search of monsters to slay. You keep your political power, you maintain your ability to, just keep North America, and you'll be satisfied with that, and you just prepare your defenses. So if anyone tries to mess with you, which they won't because you're so powerful, problem solved. Right?
Yeah.
And that is likely what some realists, some conservative realists would say that's the correct strategy. Other people would say that's all well and good. However, this excess political power should be used overseas to protect our interests. All right? So these are the more sort of expeditionary realists who would say things like, okay, yeah, fair enough. That's a good argument, except actually we do have interests overseas. Russia has huge numbers of nuclear missiles. And so it's right for us to engage in proxy wars throughout the whole of the Cold War in order to defend our interests. Because if we don't, then the entire world will become, unified under another political system, and then it will become so powerful that we won't be able to defend ourselves against it because of the total economic output. And if you follow theorists like Mackinder and Mahan, their fear is that the centralization of the entirety of Eurasia under a single political system, as we saw in the 20th century, the attempt was made by the United Soviet Socialist Republics to achieve that, would be able to produce enough economic and political power that it would be able to cross the ocean and destroy the political power of the United States and then integrate the North African continent
Oh,
into its
okay.
system. So that's the fear. So this sets up the fundamental tension between Atlanticism and Eurasianism.
Yeah, Atlanticism being the US and Eurasianism being centered on Russia.
Yes, that's right. And in this example, England is part of the Atlanticist, even though it's theoretically part of the European continent. All right.
No, I don't think I don't argue that they
That's
are strictly European. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to anger the geographers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
However, the school of international relations, which is in control of the excess political power in the United States at the moment, is the liberal internationalist school.
Okay.
The liberal internationalists reject the basis of realist argumentation, although they accept some of the basic premises, but they say, no, actually it's not okay to just completely disregard all moral decisions. That's not justified. And actually, moral, social, cultural, religious, economic, all of these sorts of things are actually really in the real world, and they need to be dealt with. So as a liberal internationalist because they accept the basic utopian premise that all of humanity should be freed inside the Western Enlightenment model to seek their own pluralist development where possible, and that this freedom is the right of every human being as laid out by the United Nations Declaration of Human
which
Rights,
is
that kind of thing.
extension of the nicer side of the Enlightenment values.
Yeah, so liberal internationalists seek to use the excess power produced by the North American continent for the purpose of freeing people in the liberal Enlightenment mold. This is why they're internationalists, this is why they're liberals. The problem with that is that it brings that excess power, and just to put it in perspective, when I say excess power of the United States, I'm referring to the collective might of the United States armed forces in Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, and cyber divisions, which, frankly, if it came down to it, if it was the United States against the world, the United States would win, not including nukes.
Because it's the most diversified military, right? Like, you might have more soldiers from China or something, but you don't have that big a navy, that big troops, that big an air force,
and also
all the high tech.
And also, the European continent has been undergoing military starvation since 1945 outside of Russia, because NATO has said, we're going to do all of the heavy lifting because we don't trust you guys to have guns, because the last two times you tried that, it was terrible.
Okay, but I thought you were also going to say just the fact of, and this is what the European Union was trying to address, of having so many powers next to each other meant they were always expending in a way that US US does have to do now, but it hasn't always had to do.
Well, the European Union is basically an institutional development of the Common Coal and Steel organisation, which was created because coal and steel was the basis of militaries. So the idea is, if there was a common market, then everybody would be able to afford coal and steel at the same price. So it would be really difficult to have really efficient production, as Germany does in coal and steel, and that was interpreted as being the basis of the national power. So it solves the German problem, because now Germany doesn't have to be the first mover in any attack on the European continent, because everybody has access to the same prices of those things. And that got turned into the European Union, and now the European Union is a ever closer union of complete economic things. A complete economy extends the logic of the common coal and steel
and by
society into everything.
European Union was also going for the type of globalism I was trying to go. Eventually, it's all one place without passports. They got pretty close. You didn't need passports. You just needed an ID card, one currency. It was part of this idea of one world nation. They were pushing towards that dream as well as the geopolitics you're talking about. So there was that ideological dream.
The EU dream and the Atlanticist dream are the same dream, except in the EU it only applies to Europe, whereas in Atlanticism it applies to the world.
Yes,
that's why they're natural allies.
But it was going to extend into Asia in the
Yeah,
traditional sense,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
into Turkey and places like this.
Yeah, yeah. The occupants of Brussels will eventually, if it succeeds in unifying the European continent in the way that it actually wants to,
Yeah,
as in the American model of a sort of
yeah,
United States republic,
yeah,
then of course it will naturally expand its tentacles outwards and slowly grow into everything because that's the nature of liberalism,
yeah,
to be constantly expanding. Which returns me back to my original point, which
yeah,
is the problem with the liberal internationalists is that now that they have all of that power is now under the control of people who are doing things for moral reasons, not strategic
yes,
reasons. And if you don't share the morality
uh,
of the United States elite,
yeah,
well, guess what? Now you are not only a person who sort of has a sort of basic political or disagreement or moral disagreement with a
yeah.
particular outlook on life. Now you are the enemy of the United States armed forces.
Cool. Can I? Okay. The
And
first thing with that,
that is the point that I'm trying
I
to
totally
bring
agree
to.
with
That's the
you.
problem.
I'd say that it's impossible not to have a moral argument. You're always going to have it. Two, that this is part of the problem that people are having, that news media is having. They're looking at the Russia Ukraine invasion. One, they're confused as to why Russia's doing it. And the big part of that confusion is they're looking at only in terms of pragmatism, and it doesn't look. There's elements of it being pragmatic in the sense of, as you outlaid in some of your videos on YouTube that people should go and have a look at,
Thank
of
you.
pushing a border down to a smaller, more defensible border closer to the west. But they they don't want to give airtime to Dugin, the philosopher of Putin, who's suddenly become extremely important. Um, so they're missing ideology of it, which is exactly what the undercurrent to what you're trying to say, which we're kind of moving towards, which is the Eurasianism. The idea that there should Dugin is, and I'm always find it hard to figure out how genuine Dugan is, because he is somewhat of a troll, right? But he's arguing, no, the world would be a fairer place if we had plurality of societies, and there was an Arabian world and a Western world and a Russian world, and it's like that. So in a way, like it's a morally good thing to come in and take back Ukraine, which was where the Russia started, and it belongs to us as the same people. It's like, okay, Ukrainians don't think that.
Yeah, please
They're
please ignore the fact that also perfectly aligns with all of the amoral geostrategic goals of Russia.
Of course, yeah, yeah, but you're always going to have both.
Well,
You have to
okay,
tell a story to you have to tell a story to your soldiers as to why they should shoot those people, and that has to be moral.
well, okay. So let me backpedal and defend my discipline.
Yeah.
Realists do not believe that morality doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Their argument is that in order to understand the strategic concerns of a state, because
Hmm.
states are the subject of the study of realism, not people, not individuals, not demographics, states. In order to understand the strategic interests of states, one first must make an amoral analysis of
Yeah.
those strategic things, and then afterwards, if one wishes to, you can have a kind of moral agreement of that now, or a moral understanding, or make moral arguments after that fact. Now, it is in the strategic interests of states to propagandize, and it's in the interests of propagandists to use moral terminology. So let us
Um.
not confuse these three things: strategic analysis,
Hmm.
the moral world,
Hmm.
and the propagation of propagandistic moral language. Those are
Just
three
just a
completely
quick thing for
unoverlapping
just a quick thing
groups.
for our listeners. Can you outline exactly what you mean by propaganda, because it's mostly used as a pejorative term? rather than a neutral term.
Um,
Clearly,
yeah,
it's the story you tell people in order to get certain things done.
I don't have a convenient definition on hand, and I was using it in a pejorative sense,
You
but
were? Okay, there we
yeah,
go. Yep.
yeah, um,
So I think I asked the question is I asked you a question a while ago. Is propaganda necessarily lies, or is it just a story that you tell people in order to get certain things done, and it could be the truth that you say that. And I think you said it's beyond a lie somehow.
where the best propaganda is truth, obviously,
Yeah.
but all propaganda, from the perspective of the propagandist, all propaganda is good propaganda, right? White,
Mm.
grey, or black.
Okay, so the issue of tension I have is this idea. Firstly, I agree that there are no ideological wars. There's no purely ideological wars. It's always some resources, some power, something. The closest thing you get is slave revolts. Like the Haitian slave revolt is the most interesting. Um, it's an extraordinary time in history. Anyway, go look that up. I won't get onto it. But where it is like freedom but it's still like the, there's a lot of people have the silly idea that that religions cause wars.
Yeah.
It's no, religions are the stories, the banner. So my argument is yes, I totally agree that there is always power, resources, territory, geopolitical safety behind wars, these reasons, economy sometimes. Um, but where I disagree with perhaps is that that's that's the main thing you should look at. And ideology is always second. It's like, no, I think they're deeply intertwined. I think
Mm.
the ideology informs the the wants of power. And an example of this is it's just human nature. Happiness is, or the idea that you're doing well in your life, the idea that you have status, the concept of status is always in comparison. It's never, I have 5 oranges, 4 oranges is the level of happiness, and therefore I'm beyond it, and therefore I'm happy. No, it's, oh no, oranges are the thing. That guy's got 12 oranges, that's got 20, I've only got 5. It's always, so it becomes ideological inbuilt. Do you know what I mean? We've
Yeah.
got more, we're all getting fat, we've got more food, we're not dying of starvation, and yet we're still going to have military conflicts. Like it's not just about physical
Well,
sources of power. It's like,
this is the basic argument of the constructivist school of international relations, is that because we're both the subjects of power as well as the creators of power, therefore there's actually a feedback loop where we're
feedback loop.
always we're always re-influencing ourselves.
Yeah. So
However,
what I'm interested in is the Western media is not discussing the ideology of why Russia's going into Ukraine, what that means to this, and compared to my thesis at the beginning, Dugan has said that he is anti-progress, which means he's not a futurist. He's not this 21st century thing, and therefore I'm
let's
wondering if there's
slow
if
that
he
down a little bit.
yeah.
Okay. Duganist Eurasianism is against progress if
Mm,
what progress means is the slow swallowing of the entire world by
mm,
Atlanticist moral modes. But if you look at the recent construction of the Cathedral to the Russian armed forces,
mm.
it's impossible for me to interpret that in any mode outside of futurism. Because
Oh, how so?
but at a architectural, cultural, and artistic level, it looks towards a Russian future in which the cultural and artistic modes of Russia are propagated in a successful way, which is accepting of its own power and reproduces its own self, both militarily, culturally, and artistically.
Are
Or at
they not?
least that's my impression when I look at that building.
Did they not build that building in order to get back to the greatness of the past, of the beauty of the Orthodox tradition? Was it not this looking backwards at your ancestors thing that I started with?
Yes, but it was
Yeah.
looking backwards in order to move forward.
It's not that.
Okay, let me set up
Remember,
an
just a second.
opposition.
Remember my
Okay,
metaphor? I wasn't saying that people don't move forward. I was saying they walk backwards through time.
yeah.
That's the standard thing human beings do. They walk backwards watching their footsteps as they're being created,
Hmm.
measuring everything they do in the past. And
Hmm.
we had this weird thing where humans turned around the other way and made the future the thing that they oriented themselves towards instead of
I
the
understand
past.
that.
So it's not building the cathedral of the armed forces, a walking backwards maneuver rather than a walking forwards maneuver, like
Uh,
as ideologically.
I can see. Okay, I can see your argument, and I can
Yeah,
see
thank
why
you.
you would make that point. I don't think that that's correct,
Okay,
and I need to add more detail to it in order to make this argument.
good.
And here I'm resting a bit on John David Ebert, respect to the
Yeah,
master.
who we're both big fans of.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in terms of cultural analysis, he's untouched.
yeah.
Um, yes, the cathedral looks backward in the sense that cathedrals are from the past to Western eyes. All right. And
Yeah,
in some sense, the West looks to the future, it's future oriented, because it rejects its own past.
yeah,
Let me make a Spenglerian point. If Russia, as a cultural genesis nexus, is coming to the point where the seed of the Russian past is starting to flower at just the very first beginning moments of its shoots beginning to branch out, and I think that Ebert is right that the cathedral is a sign of this.
Can we just
The
quickly, for our listeners, John David Ebert, who we're both big fans of, who's a cultural critic, philosopher, spiritualist, and has recently made a bunch of videos in which he's looking at what and essays. He's got a really great Substack. It's cheap. It's worth reading his stuff. He writes these essays, and he's talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine being that the Russia is, in his eyes, through the Spengler model, its own civilization, separate from the West. That this movement into Ukraine is what he calls his term a boundary act, um, in which it's affirming itself as its own empire, with the NATO border on Poland being the boundary that they're trying to that the NATO overstepped. They tried to have Ukraine, and it's going back, and that the wider model is from the Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, the idea that in the 20th century onwards, there's been a slow, gradual decline of the West that I understand needs to be centuries long, maybe 300 years, maybe longer. And the model of the Roman Empire decline, which was 300 years long. And that what we are seeing is Russia becoming a new empire, and how long empires last, 1 or 2 thousand years.
yeah,
So we're seeing the West going under, Russia coming up. So there's a big, wide picture timescale model. Yeah, this is what. Yeah, and so I'm not. My vision I set up for this video is not I've been watching that stuff. I'm not sure about it. Um, but I can see that it's at least the end of what was going on in the 20th century. Cool. Anyway, hopefully that clumsily brings watchers up with what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you for doing that. Yeah, so my argument is that in order for the Russian cultural genesis to occur, it can't be like the West that rejects its past. It has to accept it. But I don't believe that that's an indication that it is backwards facing in your
Mm,
model, because in order to grow, it has to feel internally valid that it is right on a kind of
mm,
universal moral scale as it expands towards this universal state, to that it is morally right for it to expand its own cultural influence out into the world. And that's the sense that I mean, that it's forward facing towards the future. This is not just a replication of the sort of Russian cosmists, sort of Soviet futurism, but a deeper kind of expression of the instincts of the Russian soul, or what Dugin would call in Heideggerian terms, um, the nation's own sense of its own being, pushing
mm.
out into the world in a way that it regards as valid.
So they're not modeling themselves on a previous empire, then, the way that United States and things like a lot of cultures in the West model themselves on Rome. Can't we get back to Rome?
I think Western classicism is a really important point to make.
Yeah.
Um, and because the Russian culture in this analysis hasn't fully been given birth to yet, it's impossible entirely to say what shape it will take. But what it is not doing is saying
Mm.
that the Kievan Rus was a mistake and we must move away from it.
Well, clearly there's a little bit of aping of the past because for that very point. Why
Yeah,
do they
but
need?
no,
Why
no
do
but
they need Kiev? You know?
yeah. But the point I'm making is not that
Yeah.
your criticism is wrong in the sense that it's not involved with the past. My criticism is that it's not an
Yeah.
aping. That it's a genuine growth development
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
exactly the same way that the seed turns into the tree. The
Okay, so maybe I'm stuck on my metaphor, but and you can tell me that could be your answer if that's the case. But if seeing my metaphors was backwards walking cultures orientating themselves towards the past and forwards um, walking cultures orientating themselves towards the future, is there a metaphor in there for what Russia's doing? Twirling towards the future. No, I don't know, what is it?
well, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I feel like for a culture to grow, it
Mm,
must both be involved in its past in a valid way
mm.
and into the future, propagating itself in a valid way.
That's fair, but what do they want? What what does being truly Russian mean? If and I guess I'm asking this because I feel like you're suggesting that they've never felt truly Russian to the extent that they want. Like, what's their ideal? What's their ideal Russia?
Well, I mean, Westerners like us can never understand the depths of the Russian soul,
Yeah,
mysterious
well, there
Russian
we
soul
go.
anyway, so it's probably wrong for us to prognosticate on that
Yeah,
specific
cool.
issue.
That's
Um,
fair.
but you're right, this is an exact problem that I've had with the Spenglerian model. Well, excuse
Mm.
me, hasn't the Russian Empire existed since 1300 or 1400 or something like that? So what, is the last 700 years just purely dormancies? Or
Oh,
has it
okay.
been a
So,
series of missteps where it's attempting to where it's imitations to attempt to imitate the West have caused it to have a
yes,
constantly repeating dormancy until
yes.
now, and it's only once it gets not only free from Western power in the sense of um, political and military power, but in the sense of going, not only are we not Western. We don't want to be Western. Attempts to imitate Western models have all ended in failure. Therefore, we will
Yeah,
be
well, that's what.
Russian in a new way.
Okay, so that's what John David Ebert's recent articles have been about. He says that Peter the Great was uh, an ideological imposter, and that Saint Petersburg, named after him, was a an ideological imposter. That he was looking towards the West. He brought in. Is he the one that brought in French courtesans and things? Oh, not courtesans, French courtly people in order to and he was dressing up and that he was a laughing stock to the West when he turned up as a kind of um barbarian dressed as a Westerner, speaking
Yeah,
funny
yeah, they
and
put the
having
orangutan in a
funny
tuxedo.
manners.
Very funny.
So John David Ebert um puts forth, and he's a Spengleran, obviously, that Peter the Great's expansion is, yeah, an abortive attempt to copy the West and not do it as well as the West did, and that the same thing was happening with the Soviet system, which is Marxism. They import a Western concept, and that they have never had until now, and perhaps their time in the sun under their own ideology, except maybe the Slavic mythological and East Orthodox Christian tradition, which is central to Duginism.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the shaving of the boyars, right?
Right.
An issue close to both of our hearts, I'm sure.
Yeah.
We really need a Russia expert.
Yeah.
We need a
Well,
we need
maybe
a
this is
Russian
where
who's
we
an
got on.
expert in Russian history to tell us if we're pulling this out of our ass or if this is actually
No,
a
that's
real
good.
thing or not.
No, finding the boundary of what you don't know. So I think maybe we can slowly wrap up then. So I have this thesis about what the nature is of the age that's ended. Um, I've looked at the Russia conflict and said that this is indicative of that happening. Um, we have agreed we're uncertain about the nature of the next epoch. Um, and we are not saying the next epoch is Russian, but this death to pluralism, this idea that Dugin, and is he being genuine? I don't know, is arguing for a pluralistic future where there's an Islamic empire that accepts the Russian empire, that does its thing, that accepts the West, and that nobody's telling each other how to live, is indicative of a new epoch for mankind, that the globalist mission has failed.
Yeah, in geopolitics, we would call that multipolar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that the technological dream has failed and the utopian dream
Okay.
has failed. So
You know what I
can we
would.
agree? Sorry?
No, no, you go.
Can we agree that we are at the end of the ideology that led into through the 20th century?
No,
No.
because the power base of Atlanticism is intact and the
Yeah.
theoretical school that guides it is still present.
Okay, next question, just quickly. Is that going to last more than one generation?
Well,
Do you agree with my assessment that young people, though we don't know what they think yet, didn't grow up with this 20th century dream?
that's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah, that's the question I'm putting forward.
But, okay, so if we track the history of IR realism, and here I'm going to interpret that in extremely strict form,
Yeah.
from the sort of the beginning of the Rand Corporation in the 50s, the
Mm.
winning of the Cold War, the development of offensive realism, defensive realism, the branching into neoclassical realism, and all that kind of thing, at
Mm.
an academic level, because that's an obsession of elites from that particular school and position. I can't see that stopping anywhere, although obviously it will continue its development and suffer
Yeah.
mutations and that sort of thing. So in that sense, I don't see that going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the West is not going to stop being the West. That's not my argument. It's that the West expanding out into the entire world
Well,
is
so,
possibly that dream's possibly it's challenged. Let's at least say that much, if not dead in the water.
well, ever since the fall of the United Soviet Socialist Republics,
Yeah,
which in the liberal internationalist analysis was a victory for liberal internationalism. That's wrong, but that's their analysis.
yeah,
Since that date, they've suffered defeat after defeat after defeat in the real world until this day, and none of them
mm,
seem to have changed their mind. So I don't think that coming into contact with the real world is going to alter their analysis, because I think that their analysis is a
yeah.
moral analysis, not a strategic analysis.
So it needs that combination.
Yeah,
Okay,
so bad
to
news
which
for
I
Dugan.
yeah,
I think the West will is actually the constantly devouring hydra that he fears, with a
mm,
bottomless stomach that will always seek to always encompass the entire world.
yeah. Well, certainly for decades to come. Which I put this to our listeners: if you have an ideology that takes us into the new epoch, explains the world to us, and takes us out of the age of futurism, please get in touch with us here at Rogue Insider Podcast or me, Ari Freeman. I have my own YouTube channel now, Pragmatic Magical Thinking, um, which is about magic. Yeah, get in touch with us if you have the solution to the questions we've raised. Be a spokesperson for your generation, all of that.
Very good.